Here in Ruth chapter 3. Like I told you last time, in the book of Ruth in chapter 3, Naomi, who remember earlier came into the land and didn't want anybody to call her by her name, all her old lady friends, they wanted her to she wanted them to call her bitter. She named herself not pleasant, which is what her name means, or gracious one, but she wanted them to call her bitter. And now all of a sudden in Ruth chapter 3, we see Naomi's countenance lift. We see the bitterness go away. We see the complaining against God, that God had afflicted her. We see that go away for the first time in the story. We see this flicker of hope in Naomi as she starts to play matchmaker. She begins to plan a wedding, is what we see here. We'll have some questions as we go along, so get ready. Get your thinking caps ready. I'm going to ask you some questions. Naomi sees finally in chapter 3 how Yahweh is moving pieces around. She sees the hand of God in the life of her, in her own life, and in the life of her daughter-in-law Ruth, with the introduction of this man Boaz. She's seeing it. She's seeing the pieces move around in her life and in Ruth's life. And she starts to walk according to the Mosaic law, according to what she knows to be true. That's how Naomi acts, how she responds to what God puts in their path. Verse 1, this is what it says in Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her. Remember at the end of chapter 2, Ruth had come back with all this barley and showed her mother-in-law Naomi, and Naomi said, "In whose field did you go? May this man be blessed." She mentions the name Boaz to Naomi, and the matchmaker comes to life. And so here in chapter 3, we pick up that story. Naomi said to her, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Remember, the name she has in her head is Boaz. She has heard a name that's given her hope, and she turns to Ruth and says, "I have an idea. Shall I not seek security for you?" So here we see Naomi. I want to ask you in just a minute, is she right or is she wrong? Naomi, for doing what she's doing. She jumps in front of Ruth. She starts planning Ruth's life for Ruth, the way mothers sometimes do. But remember here, Naomi is the Jew and Ruth is a Gentile. She's not a Jew. She doesn't know the ins and outs of the Mosaic law that the Jews lived by. She wouldn't. She's a Gentile, but Ruth knows. And arranged marriages, another thing, arranged marriages in the days in which they lived were customary. That's how men and women got together. Mom and dad arranged for their daughter to marry a farmer or a butcher. I'm thinking of Fiddler on the Roof and the butcher that was arranged to be married to the daughter Seidel. Anyway, arranged marriages were the order of the day, and Jews often used matchmakers to find mates for their daughters. So nothing unusual is going on in Naomi taking the reins and saying, "I must arrange this relationship. I have to get involved." That's not an odd thing. Naomi has wanted this for her daughters-in-law for some time. Look what it says here. Or before we get to that, this is what Naomi wants for her daughters. Manoach is the word. When you go further into the Bible, you read a story about a woman named Hannah. We're going to come up to that very soon in the first hour as we go into the book of 1 Samuel. A lady named Hannah and her husband's name Manoach. And they are the husband and wife, the mother and father of Samuel, the great prophet, the last judge of Israel, Samuel. Well, the man's name Manoach means resting place. It's translated in my Bible as security, where Naomi says, "Shall I not seek security for you, daughter?" What is it that Naomi wants for Ruth? What does she say? "I need to seek security for you through this man Boaz." It means a resting place. It also means freedom from activity, work, strain, or responsibility. I need to take the pressure off you as a young widow. God has put in our path a kinsman redeemer named Boaz, and I must act. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. Is that right? Is she getting ahead of God or not? In Ruth's case, what it is that Naomi wanted was a husband and a home. That was the resting place that she desired for her daughter-in-law. She wanted Ruth to have a husband, and she wanted Ruth to have a home. And all of a sudden, this Boaz has come into the picture, who is a close relative of theirs, remember. Naomi has wanted this all along for Ruth. Look what it says in Ruth chapter 1, verse 9. We've gone over this just recently. Naomi says this to Ruth when she's trying to get her daughter-in-laws to stay in Moab. She says, may Yahweh, may the Lord grant that you may find rest. Same word, manoah. She's prayed for this. Don't forget that fact when I ask you the question. Naomi has prayed for this. May Yahweh grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. That's what she wants. She wants a husband and a home for her daughters. That's what she's praying for. She kissed them and they lifted up their voices and they all wept. So Naomi has wanted this for Ruth all along. She wants this young daughter-in-law of hers to find another husband since her husband is gone. So here's my question. Is Naomi wrong to seek this marriage, to play matchmaker? Is she wrong to play matchmaker and seek this marriage and seek this security for Ruth, her daughter-in-law? Or, here's the other choice, has Yahweh, God, brought this circumstance or this opportunity forward? Is this a work of God in their lives? Did Naomi not pray for this? Is this a work of God? Is this a circumstance that God is using, that He's moving through? Again, Naomi just prayed for this in this verse that we see on the board, that Ruth would find rest in the house of a husband. This is what she wants. Is Yahweh possibly answering her prayer by guiding Ruth to the field of Boaz? What do you think? Interesting. Both. But it can't be both, because the first part of the question is Naomi wrong to seek this marriage? And the other part of the question is, or is Naomi acting on a circumstance that God has put in her path and saying, this is the answer to your prayer? Which is it? It's B. So you're saying maybe Naomi wants Ruth to get married also so that her son's name would carry on. Absolutely. All those things are right. But who's in control of that? Who has brought the circumstance to bear that these two widows are all of a sudden in Bethlehem, and all of a sudden Ruth goes out one day? Listen to the story. She goes out the very first day, and she happened to end up in the field of Boaz, who just happens to be a close relative of her husband. Who brings that circumstance about? That's God. That is clearly of the Lord. So my question then is, should Naomi and Ruth just sit on the couch and wait, see what God does with this? Or is Naomi free? Does God even expect for them to act on this new circumstance that He's put into their lives? I would say that this is a great example of what I call, what other men before me have called, active dependence. Ruth could have never done this. All Ruth wanted to do was feed her family. All she wanted to do was go find food in a farmer's field so that she could feed herself and her mother-in-law Naomi. That's all she went out to do that day. And God says, just tosses her along like a ball until she ends up on one sidewalk, on one path. She ends up in Boaz's field, exactly where God wanted her. And this is a circumstance that Naomi had prayed for. I pray that the Lord grant you rest in the home of a new husband. And Naomi knows this Boaz is a close relative, and according to the law of Moses that God gave us, close relatives can redeem the family name from deceased members of the family. She's exactly walking into exactly what God laid in her path. That's my opinion. But I think it's right. I mean, it's right according to the way I read this story. God has brought a circumstance. God expects her to act on it, not just sit around and wait and see what God would do. She has a responsibility, is the other way to say this. She has to move. God has brought a kinsman redeemer, and if you know the law like Naomi did, she has to act with the kinsman redeemer. Ruth, as we saw in the story earlier, had given up on marriage. She left the land of Moab. She sacrificed going to look for a husband the way Naomi prayed so that she could take care of Naomi, her mother-in-law, in that foreign land called Israel. That was Ruth's decision. But now, in Israel, in Bethlehem, marriage is a possibility again for Ruth. And Naomi has just come to understand that marriage is a possibility for Ruth with this man, Boaz, because he's a close family member. Look what it says in verse 2. Just things to think about as we go through this. Now, is not Boaz, she says, Naomi, continuing to talk out loud, is not Boaz our kinsman? Yes, he is. With whose maids you were, behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. I can see this matchmaker thing as she's finding a situation now. Naomi is looking for a situation to put Ruth with Boaz to see how Boaz will react. And Naomi knows Boaz, the farmer, is going to the threshing floor tonight to winnow his barley. We'll talk about that in just a second. And she is going to make this event where Ruth, she's going to try to talk Ruth into going to meet Boaz on this night. Very interesting. It's nighttime. She does it under cloak of darkness. She does it to not be seen by anyone else. It's a secret event where Ruth will present herself as a widow to Boaz and basically ask her to marry her. Do the action of a kinsman redeemer and redeem my husband. Goel. We saw this last time. I want to talk just a minute about this. What is a kinsman redeemer? What is this idea that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer? What is the idea that Jesus Christ is our kinsman redeemer? Because the scripture says that Jesus is our close relative, the one who redeemed us. But what is this whole idea? What is a kinsman redeemer? How does it work is the question I'm trying to answer. We know what it is. It's a brother or a family member who marries a widow of a brother or a family member, and they have a child together, and that child takes on the name of the father and keeps his family name, his line of the family tree. So when Naomi lived with her husband, follow the story here. When Naomi lived with her husband Elimelech in Bethlehem, they lived on family land. Who gave them that land? Who is it that decided where each of the tribes of Israel would live? God did. He used Joshua to apportion the land. And when each of these families each of the tribes got into their land, even the families were divvied up portions of land. The land that Elimelech and Naomi lived on was family land. It was family land. And it would be their land forever. That was God's intention, for the family name to be the possessor of that land forever. I'm going to show you a couple verses. So when Naomi lived with her husband, they lived on family land, but Elimelech died now. So who owns the land? He dies in Moab. They've been gone for 10 years. This isn't a time when there were wills and stuff like that. Whoever owns the land is whoever had the money to buy the land. So when a kinsman redeemer, when a Goel is identified, the Goel has the right of the family to buy that piece of land back and put it into the family's name again. You get it? Terry Hammond dies. Rick King buys his land. One day somebody comes to me and says, that land is Hammond land, and I have the right to buy it back for my father. And I say, you're absolutely right. It's all yours. Here, take the deed. Pay me for it. Take the land. Put it back in Hammond name. And that's exactly what's going on here. The kinsman redeemer was to return land into the original family's name, the inheritance, the land. It had very much to do with land. So that's what the kinsman redeemer was. He had the first right to buy back the land and return it to the name of the deceased man, into the deceased man's name, so that his family would retain ownership and possession of the land that God gave them alone. You think, man, this is a lot of talk about land. Let me show you some verses. Why is it important for Israel, why is it important in Israel for family to retain their own inheritance? It's extremely important to God because the land is a gift from God. Look what it says in the Bible in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. This is the law. This is part of the 613 commandments that God gave Moses. He didn't only give the first 10 commandments. He kept on talking, and he gave Moses, if you count them, over 613 laws. The commands, we call it the Mosaic Law. And this is part of the Mosaic Law. Have you ever heard of the year of Jubilee? Why is that important? Because it's about who possesses the land. It's about land going back into into the name of the family that God gave it to. Look what it says in Leviticus chapter 25. That's why Ruth is so important. That's why the introduction of Boaz as a kinsman redeemer is so important. It's part of the law. Leviticus chapter 25 verse 10 says, "Thus you shall thus consecrate the 50th year." This is the year of Yobal, Jubilee. "You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you," look what it says, these are God's words to Moses, "each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family." God intended for families to clan. Especially in Israel, God intended for families to clan together, to live together, side by side, neighbors on the same piece of land. That's how God set it up. And in this 50th year of Jubilee, when others may have taken the land from you, when maybe a generation got poor and they had to sell the land off, in the year of Jubilee, God says, it will all return to the way I set it up. All the land goes back. Just like that. No legal documents, no signing, no money changing hands. Just like that, in the 50th year, everyone returns to their own property and Israel is cleansed again. Look what it says a few verses later in Leviticus 25, verse 23. The land, I'm talking about the land. The Goel, the Redeemer. Why is it important for Boaz to buy Elimelech's land, Malon's land? Why is it important for the land to stay in their name? It's because of the way God intended it. In verse 23, it says, "The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine." See, God stakes a claim to everything He creates. He said, the land is mine. Nobody owns it. I own it, and I determine who will live where they will live on this land. "For you," He says, "are but aliens and sojourners with me. Thus, for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land." You are to make a provision that if someone named Hammond comes along and wants to buy that land back, you have to provide for the redemption of the land, for that land to be bought, redeemed, and put back into the original family name. That's what God wanted. That's what the year of Jubilee was all about. In Leviticus 25, verse 25, the next verse, it says, if a fellow countryman, we're talking about Jews, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman, what do you think that word is? Goel. The kinsman redeemer that Boaz is and that Jesus is. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Why? Because God wants Hammon land to be Hammon land forever. That's the way God set it up. The land is His, the earth is His. We are just aliens and sojourners, He says, who I give it to, it must remain in their name. And every 50th year, it would revert back to the original name. Look what it says in verse 28. But if he has not found sufficient means, money, if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at the Jubilee, in the 50th year, it shall revert, that he may return to his property. So I've left, just as example, I've left the land of Israel in the 38th year, counting the 7 sevens, the 7 sabbatical years, and then the seventh one, the year after the year of Jubilee. I leave in year 38. My land has been sold because I couldn't afford it. I go somewhere else to try to scratch out a living. In the 50th year, I return to a land that I sold long ago, and God says, take your land back. Live on your property. I gave it to you. It's yours, free of charge. Debt was remitted. If you owed somebody $10,000 in the year of Jubilee, no more. Debt was remitted. All kinds of things happened in the year of Jubilee, but the focal point of it is that the land will go back to the way that God intended it under Joshua. And that's why we see Naomi here so excited about finding a kinsman redeemer who can buy her husband and her son's land back and continue their family name. It was important to Naomi because it's important to God. That's why this was so important. This was the Jewish way of life. And it was important to Naomi because this is what God held important. And so this is why it's an emergency to her. We have found a kinsman redeemer. We must act on this. Not only is it written in the law, but this is God's own desire. We must do this. Ruth. I love her urgency to obey the law. That's what she's doing, obeying God. Why does it have to be tonight? She says, she tells Ruth, Boaz, our kinsman, he's winnowing barley at the threshing floor tonight, but why such an emergency? Why does it have to be tonight? We ended with this verse last week, and look what it says. Look what it says. The last verse in the book of Ruth chapter 2, she stayed close by the maids of Boaz, this is Ruth, in order to glean, but for how long? Until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. It's coming to an end. The barley harvest and the wheat harvest are going to end. You're in relations with Boaz now because you're in his fields, but as soon as the wheat harvest leaves, you won't have a reason to go into his fields. We must do this now. That's why it's an emergency, because the harvest is going to end. And then what? A couple of pictures here. Anybody know what that circle is? It's a threshing floor. These threshing floors were elevated usually. They were usually on top of a mountain or top of a hill where there was good airflow. Can anybody think of the most famous threshing floor in the world? There is a threshing floor where King David saw a man threshing. His name was Araunah, and he stopped there at the threshing floor of Araunah, and he bought the land that later his son Solomon would build a building on. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is a threshing floor. So when you beat barley, this is all I know. When you harvest barley, it's on a stalk, it's a seed, and you've got to beat this. You've got to beat these things so that the seeds will come apart. And then what they do when they've got the seeds apart, they still have the what's the powdery substance? What's it called? The wheat from the chaff. You've got this junk in there. And so what Boaz is doing on this night, it says he winnows barley. And winnowing is when you would take something like a fork and throw this up into the air slightly, and the wind that's up there, this is why it's elevated, the wind would blow the chaff away and the heavier seed would fall back down to the ground. That's what he's doing tonight on a threshing floor just like this. A threshing floor just like this one. This is what he's doing. He's in a tiny village of Bethlehem. We're not talking about a metropolitan city. We're talking about a village. And there was one threshing floor, most likely, like there were in all the other little towns. On this night, Naomi knows that it is Boaz's turn to use the threshing floor, right? If there's only one, you're going to have to take turns. And tonight, it's Boaz's turn. How God got her that information, we're not told, but she knows that he will be in a solitary situation tonight, without his family, not in his home, separated from watching eyes. And she also knew that because of the value of the barley that would be gathered this night, Boaz isn't going to leave it. He's going to spend the night at the threshing floor. And that's why she sends Ruth at night, cloaked, to the threshing floor. Look what it says in verse 3. The matchmaker continues her, I want to say scheme, but I don't mean that in a negative way. She's following the lead and the circumstance that God's put in her place, and she's moving forward. She tells her daughter-in-law Ruth, wash yourself and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. This was a not to be known. It was a secret thing until a certain time. So she tells her, wash yourself, cleanse your body, anoint yourself, meaning put on your best perfume. They did have perfumes. They were all natural, like myrrh and aloe and things like that. But she also says here, and put on your best clothes. And that's a little bit misleading. Actually, it's a lot misleading. What she says is, put on a cloak, like an outer robe. Remember, this was a secret event. She didn't want her to put on her little black dress. She wants her to go clandestine, in secret, so that nobody would know it was her. Even Boaz wouldn't know it was her. And so the word that's translated here is the word for cloak. Put on a cloak, cover yourself. And so that's what she does. It shall be, she continues in verse 4, Naomi, with her ideas. It shall be when Boaz lies down. You might as well face it. There's a lot of sexual tension here. There's a lot of sexual words. But in this situation, she's not asking Ruth to do something immoral, but the words, lie down. Some of these words that I'll uncover his feet, we'll talk about in just a second, have a lot of innuendo in them, a lot of sexual innuendo built into these words. What I mean is they're used in other places of the Bible to refer to sexual events. But not in this case. Scratch that from your minds. That is not going on in the book of Ruth. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies without him seeing you, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down beside him at his feet, and he will tell you what you shall do. Uncover his feet here. We have to ask the question, what is Naomi telling Ruth to do exactly? This word uncover is used with reference to sexual content several times in the Bible, but it's usually accompanied, almost always accompanied, with another word, uncover the nakedness of. There's chapters in the Bible. There's one specifically in Leviticus that talks about you can't uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. You can't uncover the nakedness of your father's daughter. You can't uncover the nakedness of your uncle's wife. You can't uncover the nakedness. And those are all sexual as euphemism for sexual intercourse. It's about sexual immorality. You can't do all these things. But here it doesn't say uncover the nakedness. Go and uncover Boaz's nakedness. That's not what it says. She says uncover his feet. Feet here, I don't know why so much innuendo here, but feet, in at least a couple of passages in the Old Testament, this word regel is a word that euphemistically means the genital area. So some people, I'm saying all this because some people take this to be that Naomi is telling Ruth, go throw yourself at Boaz physically. Go present yourself as a woman ready, you might say. And that's not what she's doing. That's not what this means. I take this very literally here. I think what Ruth is saying is go to where Boaz is sleeping, this man of God. Why would she be following the law of Moses so precisely and then say, go immorally have sex with this man? That's not at all what she's saying. Go lie down at his feet in that breezy area up at the knoll at the threshing floor and uncover his feet. Literally uncover his feet. Take the cloth, the cover, whatever blanket he's using, take it off of his feet. This will wake him up, probably because it's cold and he gets cold. And when he wakes up and notices you, look what it says, the last line in verse 4, he will tell you what you shall do. What Ruth is doing is making it known to Boaz that I am willing to be your wife. I'm willing for you to be my kinsman redeemer. I'm willing for you to be the one to marry me and not anyone else in the family. I'm choosing you to do this if you will do it. And that's simply what's going on here. The point of all of this is to make Boaz know that Ruth will accept him. Not a younger man, this older man. He's at least a generation older than Ruth. It'd be like a woman doing this to one of her father's friends, someone in that age category. So she's making it known to Boaz that she will accept him as a husband if Boaz wants to be her husband, redeemer. That's what's going on. It's an identification verse. Identify yourself as one willing to seek his protection, to accept his protection in marriage. Verse 5, what's Ruth's response? She said to Naomi, all that you say, I will do. All that you say, I will do. We have in Naomi a woman that's obedient to the law of Moses. I showed you the verses in Leviticus about the land. If it can be redeemed, if you find a Goel, a redeemer that can buy the land back, you have to make that happen. It's very important to God, and Naomi wants to do that. She wants Boaz to buy the family land back and take Ruth as her husband. And like Terry said, ultimately have a son. That would be a dream to Naomi, that Ruth would have a son to carry on her son Mahlon, the dead man's name. All that's in this story here. No sexual content. I refuse to believe it. This is one of the lights in the Bible. I wish the Lord would have made it supernaturally light up when you turn to the pages. This is one of the lights in the Bible, the book of Ruth. And there's no way that anyone could ever convince me that what Naomi is saying is, we follow the law to a certain extent, but if you really want Boaz to attach himself to you, you got to throw yourself at him sexually. Nonsense. Furthest thing from the truth. Uncovering his feet is not a sexual advance. You want to talk about sexual advance in the Bible? It's everywhere. It's just not here. I could show you 1,000 places where immoral sex is taking place in this book. It's not in this chapter. As we'll see soon, Boaz doesn't feel himself qualified. As a matter of fact, I need a verse to stop on. Let's look at it. We'll just read it. Look at what verse 10 says. Boaz tells Ruth after this event on that night, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich." Boaz never felt himself worthy of Ruth. He's not trying to advance himself on Ruth. He understands that he's a generation away, yet Ruth has chosen him. Ruth has chosen him, and he says, "This kindness that you've done to this old man is better than all the kindnesses I heard of you in the treatment of my cousin's wife, Naomi. This kindness you've done to me blows me away. It's beyond anything I've ever heard." And that's Boaz's response when Ruth does this. There's no sexual things going on. If you just read the dialogue of what happens that night, Boaz doesn't accept her uncovering of his feet as some sort of advance. There's nothing like that's moved on in this book. Nothing. And we'll get to that when I come back from my harrowing, life-threatening, no, I'm kidding, my surgery that I am quite chicken about. Let's close in prayer tonight. Heavenly